When Chief Justice Earl Warren was charged with heading the investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy, he wanted a historian on the staff. Albert Goldberg, an Air Force historian at the time, was called in for an interview with the Chief Justice. Al asked him, "Mr. Chief Justice, why do you want a historian on your staff?" And Warren replied that his commission had plenty of elected officials, more than a dozen lawyers, an ample number of investigators, but he didn't have a historian who could place the work in some context and write a narrative about it in plain English. Al became co-writer and co-editor of the 26-volume commission report on the assassination of the president, one of his many contributions to the field of federal history. At the turn of the last century, when J. Franklin Jameson and men like Henry Adams were doing federal history without the label of being known as federal historians, the historical practice of federal history was in a different place, not only in time, but in attitude. Two former presidents of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, had served as presidents of the American Historical Association. Imagine any president of the United States assuming that role today. Henry Adams had moved to Washington in the 1870s to work as a journalist and a historian. He was trained as a medievalist, but that did not stop him from writing a 9-volume history of the United States from 1801 to 1817. That work is still a gem. J. Franklin Jameson knew Henry Adams and considered him a great man, the successor of George Bancroft. He sought Adams' advice on what he should do with his career back in 1884, the year he graduated from Hopkins, and Adams told him the best work for the beginner was editing. Well, that advice worked for me 100 years later when I worked for another Hopkins graduate, my mentor and longtime friend Lewis Harlan, on the 14-volume Booker T. Washington papers. What I discovered, however, was that editing was not just the work for beginners in history, it was often the best work for the masters. Harlan's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Booker T. Washington benefited immensely from his total immersion in Washington's large collection at the Library of Congress. It took 9 years just to complete the initial reading of that material. I was one of those that read all of those years in the bowels of the library. Harlan, like Jameson and Henry Adams before him, served as president of the American Historical Association. And then Harlan also served as president of the Organization of American Historians and the Southern Historical Association, all in the same year of 1989. Lewis Harlan was a consummate academic historian through and through. But he had the misfortune of having graduate students like me and like Pete Daniel who would become federal historians. He also knew that his good friend and colleague in the department, Sam Merrill, the last of a generation of solid political historians, was turning out students at Maryland who wandered off the academic reservation and ended up in government service. People like Dick Baker and Don Ritchie, who created the magnificent Senate Historical Office. Sam Walker, one of my classmates, became historian at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and gave the world the best account of the 3 Mile Island disaster. My poor Professor Lewis Harlan had to become a convert to federal historians and the importance of the work that they did. He became a convert because he saw federal historians had surrounded him. In his 3 presidential addresses before the major historical societies, he was critical of academic historians for their excessive specialization. In his AHA address, he said, quote, "The unity of history, the synoptic view of human experience, has been sacrificed to the compartmentalization of the discipline into geographical and topical subspecialties." Quote. In that same address, he said that the historians who are best reaching the American people are public historians and popular writers like David McCullough and Barbara So the great orb of public history that this old fly has watched from the beginning of my career has indeed moved across the sky, but it is a long way from the zenith. My generation of public historians may not see that zenith, but when I ponder the future of federal history, I begin, like most historians, with a look backward. The dimension of time is our tool, and it is time that our profession went back to the future. Henry Adams is my touchstone for past historians, and he is the one that helps me see the future. Henry Adams made sweeping assumptions about history. His approach was synoptic, broad themes, overarching views that Harlan said was lacking in many academic historians today. In Adams' case, there is no finer example than his seminal chapter in The Education of Henry Adams, called The Virgin and the Dynamo. The Virgin, the ultimate symbol of the medieval world, a world ordered around the church, with the cathedral as the highest expression of humankind's aspirations. But along comes the dynamo, the magnificent, powerful symbol of the future. The dynamo was all about industrial power. It represented the age of science and engineering. Before Adams died in 1918, he witnessed electricity, automobiles, airplanes, transcontinental radio, telegraphy, skyscrapers, and a world war like no other. Here we are a century beyond the world of Henry Adams. The really new thing is the digital revolution. Last month, the New York Times declared that we are now in the age of big data. It is not as symbolically dramatic as Adams' Virgin or the dynamo, but it is every bit as much transformational. This revolution affects us all and has powerful ramifications for federal historians. There are many reasons why agencies of government and branches of government save records. Mostly it is because of legal requirements related to accountability. But some of the reasons first stated by the founders of this nation still apply. Thomas Jefferson said it was the duty of government to preserve a history of what it had done. James Madison said that for the republic to survive, the public needed good, reliable information. If the United States is going to remain a great experiment in representative government, it must keep its important records and see that these records are explained in their historical context. Federal historians are regular users of government records, and they need to be prominent players in determining what gets saved in this digital age and how it is presented to policymakers and the public. I remember a time when there were more historians on the staff of the National Archives and fewer records managers. There was a time when people devoted their careers to knowing certain record groups, and scholars both inside and outside the government would turn to these masters of the stacks and find what they needed. I remember when the National Archives and Records Administration was called the National Archives of the United States, a name that spoke to the preservation and dissemination to the memory of a great nation, and not just a place where records are administered. But I'm still very grateful for the historians that continue to work at the National Archives, and can only say, may your tribe increase for the benefit of us all. In the age of big data, federal historians often find themselves on the horn of this information dilemma. There are miles and miles and tons of paper records, and now archivists and federal historians are overwhelmed by terabytes of data that are born digitally, managed digitally, and accessed digitally. Digital records as a class of information have become the most problematic challenge to all federal agencies. To the uninitiated, digital records appear easy to store, relatively speaking. George W. Bush's electronic records currently sit on a couple of tables next to a desktop computer connected to several servers at the National Archives in a special vault awaiting transfer to the Bush Library in Texas. They just sit there looking almost peaceful and almost as compact as a typical setup at your home computer. Except most of us do not have 78 terabytes of email and other electronic communications. We cannot keep up with the accumulation of government records. House and Senate records alone constitute more than 500 million pages and grow at about 10 million pages a year. Various legislative commissions, including the 9/11 Commission, added 20 terabytes of e-records to the congressional holdings. The presidential libraries have similar vast volumes of paper and now digital records, and all of it growing like topsy. The federal government has pumped more than $500 million into an electronic records archive. This is a major initiative at NARA. This is a very important project, but it is a tiny first step. The future is digital for sure, but getting there is so monumental that a much higher level of commitment, funding, and human resources are going to be necessary in order for us to realize that future. If we don't make this commitment, we might as well invite the British to come back on the anniversary of the burning of Washington in 2014 and burn our federal records one more time. 15 years ago, when the Archivist of the United States, John Harlan, proposed that the National Archives devote a major part of its resources to figure out how to store and access electronic records, his plan included reductions in resources devoted to paper records. And I wrote an article in the Chronicle of Education, Chronicle of Higher Education, criticizing him for this and urging him not to sacrifice the records of the earlier history of the nation to the problems created by this new class of records. I made a few archivists around the country mad because I cited J. Franklin Jameson, a historian and manuscript curator who could at times be condescending toward his archival colleagues. Jameson wrote more than a half century before the digital revolution, and this is what he said, quote, "The tendency of archivists, left to their own devices, is to give the foremost position to those classes of documents which have most occupied their attention, which usually means those which give them the most trouble." End of quote. There is no question that the records that are giving the National Archives fits these days are the digital ones. How do we capture them? How do we store them? How do we access them? How do we keep up with technology that changes faster than policymakers and archivists can think and execute plans? One of the assumptions of the digital revolution is that government agencies and the public expect records to be readily available and easily available online. Nobody wants to wait for information anymore. Give it to me now and give it to me on my home computer. And give it to me free of charge. In recent years, we've seen an explosion in online access and tremendous volumes of historical documents and government records. And it wasn't that many years ago, 3 decades ago to be exact, that a lot of this was pretty primitive stuff.